People come to history for different reasons. Some just want to know what happened. You know, what are the basic facts of what happened at some point in the past. Others want to make political points, or they want to make political arguments, or they want to have some kind of political weapon, and they'll turn to history for that reason. And certainly that's the case in the 21st century, but I think it's been the case since ancient times. There are different motivations, different interests people have when they come to the study of history. In my own case, I'm primarily interested in the study of human nature. I'm interested in people, and I'm interested in what they do, why they do what they do. And therefore, I've always seen in my own mind, I've always sort of seen history as kind of a branch of psychology. And I'm interested in questions like why? Why did people do what they did at some moment in the past? What motivated them? What assumptions did they have? Sometimes those assumptions were wrong. But even when you ask the question, well, but why did they have that assumption, even if that assumption was wrong, you can still learn about the past, and you can learn about human behavior, human thought processes. These are the kinds of questions I bring to really to every historical topic, but the historical topic I'm thinking of now is the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. About 110,000, I've seen another figure, 120,000 Japanese Americans are interned in the United States during the Second World War, and about 2/3 of these were U.S. citizens. So why did that happen? What led to that? Now, one of the things we have to say at the outset is that this is a regrettable thing. I don't think that there are very many people in the United States who are willing to defend this policy of the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. I think it's universally recognized as a mistake. And here we see a photo of President Ronald Reagan, who in 1988 made a statement acknowledging that this was a mistake, and those Japanese Americans who were still alive, who had been interned in the Second World War and who were still alive in 1988, they received some compensation. And part of what President Reagan says is that shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000, he says, persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. So President Reagan says that we shouldn't pass judgment on the people who made that decision to intern Japanese Americans. Well, of course, you know, a lot of folks do pass judgment on them. What I want to do is try to understand why they did that. What motivated them to do that? Now, if you look up the topic in general history textbooks, you'll notice that I have the word hysteria there circled. And that's a common word, and that's a word that shows up at a few different points it often shows up at a few different points in American history as described in history textbooks. Was there hysteria following the attack on the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941 by the armed forces of Japan? Was there a kind of hysteria? I think the answer to that is probably yes. But what occurs to me is that that word hysteria doesn't really explain anything. There was hysteria, to some extent anyway, but why? What was behind it? What was underneath it? What led to it? In the sentence below, the textbook writer here refers to anti-Japanese prejudice. And there was that, but why? And these are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in as I come to this topic. So we want to say that to try to understand is not to excuse. So for example, if you ask the question, why did about 20 young men who identified as Muslim, why did they agree to become part of a plot to fly planes into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and then I think another Another target was the U.S. Congress, but that plane crashed elsewhere. This is, of course, referring to the terrorist events of September 11th, 2001. To try to understand why they did that, what motivated them, what ideas did they have in their heads, what motivations did they have. To try to understand that is not to excuse. Of course, the end result is inexcusable, right? But there might be some value in trying to understand. I hope that we can see the distinction. To try to understand, which means putting a pause on my own judgments for a minute and trying to understand, why did this seem like something that these young men thought they should do? Trying to see the world from their point of view, but not with the goal of excusing. I hope we're able to make that important distinction. Or this is an example of something that I actually do study, and it's the case of this young woman named Annie Moore, who was at the center of influence with a charismatic sort of radical figure named Jim Jones, who had more than 900 members of his movement called the People's Temple. They had moved from the United States to Guyana in South America. And on November 18th, 1978, they committed the greatest mass murder-suicide in modern history. And we have letters written by Annie Moore. And in fact, Annie Moore, as this tragedy was unfolding, and actually as it probably had unfolded, and she may have been the very last one alive at this place called Jonestown, she wrote what is actually, I think, in many ways, a moving document about, why this had happened. When you read Annie Moore's letters, you don't often feel that you're in the presence of a person who is crazy. You don't often feel that you're in the presence of a person who is a radical. You certainly don't usually feel that you're in the presence of somebody who actually could play a central role in the mass murder-suicide of over 900 people. But that is the case. Annie Moore actually did write a memo to Jim Jones, basically advocating mass suicide. So to try to understand Annie Moore and where she's coming from, how in the world, could she have gotten into this? How did this make sense to her? To try to do that is not to excuse. Of course, the end is inexcusable. But there is value in trying to understand. And simply dismissing her as a radical, well, that might be true, a political radical, right? That might be true, but it doesn't explain anything. It doesn't help us to understand. So I hope we can see the tightrope that we're trying to walk. When we look at this question of the interning of Japanese Americans during the Second World War, one important thing to note is that the United States is not the only country to do this. Among Canadians, this is a major part of their history when they think about the Second World War. Japanese living in British Columbia in Western Canada were also interned. As you can see the list here, a number of countries in different ways were involved in the interning of Japanese during the Second World War. So whatever reason is given when we think about why the United States did it, it's important to remember that this is something that was broader, that a number of countries participated in the same thing. That's part of the context. Here's just a notice from Canada. And so the same thing happened in Canada and other countries. Many of us have seen these maps before where the different camps are. I'm in the state of Arkansas. You can see that there are 2 internment camps in the state of Arkansas, and there are other internment camps in different parts of the U.S., and there were internment camps in Canada and in other countries as well. Japanese living in South America, south of the U.S. border, some of them also were actually rounded up in their countries and then interned in the United States. And so, for example, about 1,800 Japanese living in Peru were gathered up in Peru and sent to the United States and put into an internment camp in Texas. And so you have other countries participating in this process of interning Japanese during the Second World War. To make things complicated and to add a bizarre twist to things is that even as you have Japanese Americans interned in these camps, some of the young men who actually were interned in these camps will themselves actually join the U.S. Army and will be part of the famous 442nd Infantry Regiment, which will fight in Italy and southern France, and which will be recognized as a tremendously valiant and heroic fighting force during the Second World War. And so this is admittedly quite bizarre. This is, it's hard to understand this, that the parents of some of these soldiers who are fighting valiantly for the United States, some of their parents are interned in the United States. Many of their parents are interned in these camps in the U.S. So this is a mystifying and bizarre moment in American history. The policy is challenged and goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decides on a 6-3 majority that the policy is not unconstitutional, or that the policy does not breach the Constitution. One of the dissenters, named Justice Frank Murphy, his argument had substantially to do with racial discrimination. So he says racial discrimination in any form and in any degree has no justifiable part whatever in our democratic way of life. And you can look at what Murphy goes on to say. But basically saying that racial discrimination, breaching of basic rights, is unconstitutional, and the racial origin of the American citizen doesn't really matter. And so Murphy concluded that the internment policy then was unconstitutional. The majority opinion, expressed by Justice Hugo Black, emphasizes the perceived military necessity of the internment process. And so we have a Japanese American who challenges this policy named Korematsu. And so Black writes, Korematsu is not excluded from the military area, that is, we're speaking of the West Coast, because of hostility to him or his race. He was excluded because we are at war with the Japanese Empire. Now the immediate response to that is, but Korematsu is not part of the Japanese Empire. He is an American, right? And so does this really make sense, right? And this is part of the historical discussion. Because the properly, going on is what Hugo Black says, the properly constituted military authorities feared an invasion of our West Coast. So this is a key thing. There's a fear that the Japanese will invade the West Coast. And there's a fear then the Japanese living in the West will join those Japanese invaders, and then the U.S. will have a bigger problem on its hands. Now looking back, the prospect of Japan invading California, let alone succeeding in invading California, let alone succeeding in holding whatever territory had been acquired as a result of invading, looking back, that seems very, very unlikely, right? But remember, we live decades on. We have the clarity of hindsight. And the question is, what was going on in people's minds at the time? So what I'm passing to you mostly are things that I picked up in the course of researching some books that I wrote. And these are books about sort of the development of Alaska in the late 1800s, early 20th century. So I wasn't specifically studying the question of the internment of Japanese, but information came up that over time helped me to understand, I think to some degree, how that happened. One of the really surprising documents I came across was published in Reader's Digest in January 1942, which indicates to me, I think what this means is that this article was written and ready to be published before the attack of December 7th, 1941. So this article appears, I'm not exactly sure when it appeared, at the end of December, at the beginning of January, I'm not sure. But right around the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, this article came out, Japanese Saboteurs in Our Midst. And the theme of the article is clear in the title. There's a concern that there are a lot of Japanese living in Hawaii, in California, in Oregon, in Washington, who who are ready to pounce. They are spies, and if the Japanese invade, if we have a war with Japan, they are ready to join the other side. Now we look back and say, no, not true, right? Not true, not true. But that's what we know. This article was written at the time. Put yourself in the position of people at the time. Pearl Harbor's just been hit, right? Surprise attack, Japanese military. And then right around that same time, this article comes out in this national publication. It's not hard to understand how people will come to certain conclusions, and it's not hard to understand how people will then be okay doing things that in a different context they would see, this isn't a good idea. For example, the internment of Japanese during the war. Recently I was going through a diary, a handwritten diary. So this is an unpublished diary. And by a sailor named Irwin Raglan, serving aboard the USS Chester. And when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, the Chester was out at sea. But the Chester comes into Pearl Harbor the next day, and Raglan writes in his diary about what he saw at Pearl Harbor. And then it's quite remarkable because Raglan then goes on to describe all sorts of things that he says happened at Pearl Harbor and in Hawaii that did not happen. So, for example, this. A beach defense party stopped enemy troops that tried to land at Nanakuli Beach. In other words, a force of Japanese tried to assault a certain beach on the island of Oahu, which is about 20 miles from Pearl Harbor. An estimated 3,000 Japs were killed. A small band of American Marines stopped them with machine guns. There was not one live Jap that got ashore. Of course, he's using the language of the day. 10 Army truckloads of dead Japs were hauled away from the beach. All parachute troops landed dead. There were no Jap prisoners taken. All were killed. So the first thing we notice is the use of that word Jap, which of course makes us very uncomfortable, and but part of doing history is just letting people in the past be people in the past. And so this is his diary as he wrote it. But what's most remarkable about this and a number of other things he writes is that this did not happen. Nothing close to this even happened. This is complete fabrication. And yet when you read the diary, it's clear that Irwin did not think of it as fabrication. That after the attack on Pearl Harbor, some sort of psychological condition was created, that these stories began to spread like wildfire. And this is just one of several stories that Irwin Raglan writes about in his diary. And it's remarkable, and it gives us insight into kind of a psychological frenzy, or if that's the right word, a psychological turmoil or something like that, that is triggered by the attack on Pearl Harbor. Which leads me to think that there's something underlying this. There's something sort of underlying this that was set off by this attack on Pearl Harbor. Let's look at some of the background. In 1854, Japan was all but isolated. In 1854, Japan is basically forced open. It needs to trade with the world. This is inevitable. There's no way that Japan can remain isolated much longer just because of the way the world is developing. So Japan does open up. By 1900, Japan is a very resource-poor country and is not able to feed its own population. And so Japan begins a process of very rapidly building an empire. And it's really one of the most remarkable stories in history, how Japan goes from being almost completely isolated to less than 50 years later becoming a significant force in the Pacific. It is true that the government of Japan did encourage Japanese emigration. That is, the government of Japan encouraged Japanese to emigrate to other places. And this is part of a broad empire-building scheme. It's remarkable that just 50 years after opening up to trade, Japan defeats in a short, nasty, and for Russia, humiliating war. Japan defeats Russia. And you see that first cartoon little Japan, this small resource-poor country, defeats Russia, this huge country, in a short war. And, you know, much of that victory hinged on one great surprise attack, which is important historically because the Japanese thought, well, we effectively knocked the Russians out of a war with one great surprise attack. We can do the same with the Americans. But to get to the point we're on now, this country, which had been almost completely isolated in 1854, 50 years later, defeats Russia, huge Russia, in a war. The empire building goes on, and as a result of this war with Russia, Japan occupies Korea, and the process of empire building goes on. And you see the map here. This is Japan's empire as of 1939. And so it's rapid growth, this empire that Japan builds. It's not difficult to find in newspapers articles about Japan. For example, this article here refers to Japan's victory over Russia. And down at the end of that, near the end of that article, it says, the Japanese must secure the affections of mankind. That is, if people love a winner, then Japan is a winner. No one can deny that when it comes to fighting, they stand at the top of pugnacious people, that is, of fighting people. So Japan has a reputation by 1905 of being a very serious fighting country. And of course, that does turn out to be true. That small resource-poor Japan gives the large resource-rich United States a very difficult fight in the Second World War. What's interesting is that when we think of racial animosity, the normal way we think of that is, you know, my group is better than that group, and therefore I don't like that group. What's interesting is that when it comes to Japan, it's not hard to find resources that indicate that we are worried that that group is superior to our group, and that's why we don't like them. This article here, if you look down in the second section, it says there are anthropologists who believe that the white race is rapidly degenerating and that the yellow race is destined to dominate the world. Now this gets at certain ideas that were around at the time, and we won't get into those. But the previous article, recognizing that Japan is a serious sort of fighting force. This article, a sense that that Asia's on the rise, and that Western civilization, Western cultures that emerge from Europe, that they may be in decline. A sense that this rising Asian power is in some way perhaps superior to us. One of the things that happens in the United States, is in the West Coast especially, is that there's a strong interest in keeping out Japanese immigrants. And a reason for that, one of the reasons, is a fear that the Japanese immigrants will outcompete us. And so if you look at the bottom of this article, the chief objection to the Japanese is not racial antipathy, but the knowledge that their economic advantages make it hopeless for the white race to compete with them. So this is interesting. You know, the racial tensions that are there are different things going on, but one of the things that's going on, at least for some people, is a sense that we're worried that that group is better than my group, and that's why we don't like them. All right? And this kind of language, this way of thinking, is very common at this time. And one of the things we have to get used to in history is that, you know, the past is a foreign country, right? People in the past thought differently than we do. They think differently than we do. And one of the things we need to do is let them be themselves. It doesn't mean we don't criticize. It doesn't mean we don't come to conclusions. But if we want to try to understand where they were coming from, we need to let them speak and try to understand where they're coming from. This is an article that basically says that, you know, that one characteristic of the Japanese is that their first loyalty is to Japan. And so it really doesn't matter if they're working here in the United States. If Japan goes to war, the heart of the Japanese living in the United States is immediately with Japan. That turns out not to be the case. But this is I think, a fairly widespread view. And all of these things are part of kind of the mental furniture that people have. as they move into late 1941. And when that attack comes on Pearl Harbor, these ideas, these concepts that people have picked up, I think, get tapped into. And I think it helps to explain the response that people have. Here's an article I found from 1907. Nome, Alaska, there's a big gold rush. And so this article here, I'll just summarize it, just says, we don't have much security here in Nome. We don't have much protection here in Nome. What if someday the Japanese just decide to come into Nome and take all of the gold? No one will be able to protect us. But notice the assumption that if some foreign power came in and attacked us and took all of our gold, who would it be? It would be the Japanese. And so here we're in 1907, but there's thinking about the possibility of an invasion. That's important because this thinking will go on. Here we have an article that talks about the fear of a Japanese invasion, not only of the American West Coast, but of the Philippines and Hawaii. Look at the last sentence. What is more natural for them, that is the Japanese, than to look at the rich lands of the Philippines, the great plantations of Hawaii, and even our own golden California? Of course, right at the beginning of the Second World War, the Japanese do hit Hawaii. They do hit the Philippines. And so for people who are aware of these kinds of thoughts, they can say, well, the Japanese did hit Hawaii. The Japanese did hit the Philippines. Maybe California's next. We can look back and see, no, that's not plausible because Japan is so far away from, California is so far away from the resources that Japan would have to launch an invasion. But we're talking about the psychological context of that time. By 1942, the beginning of 42, we can see that Japan has built a formidable empire. The Philippines, which had been under the American flag by mid-1942, is now part of the Japanese empire. Word spreads through the United States, and it's been known really for decades that the Japanese military machine is very brutal, not just against American prisoners, British prisoners, French prisoners captured in war, but even more brutal toward other Asians, Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, later Vietnamese. So one of the other things that gets added to the thoughts that people have about the Japanese is that this is a serious fighting force, and there's also something about it that's very brutal. The torture, the murder of prisoners, the torture, the murder of civilians, all of this happened. And so we have this attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Articles like this are out there already. Articles like this appear right around the same time. A certain psychological environment exists. Dr. Seuss, of course, famous for Green Eggs and Ham and The Grinch, has cartoons that tap into this. They fear that the Japanese Japanese living in the United States, Japanese living in the West, will act as spies, will act as agents on behalf of the mother country. And so we have the internment policy. What Justice Black refers to, that there's kind of a military necessity. We look back and say, no, actually there wasn't a military necessity. The Japanese living in California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, they actually weren't a threat, right? I'm not aware of any credible information that they were a threat. So the factual question isn't really on the table. The question is, why did people think they were a threat? And I think some of the things that we've mentioned help to explain that. Now, one of the weird things, of course, is that the Japanese in Hawaii itself are not interned. And so there are bizarre twists to this story. The Japanese, even as their parents are interned in camps, fighting with the 442nd in Italy and southern France, that's bizarre. Hawaii, where the threat seems to be greater, the Japanese are not interned there. And so there are, truly sort of bizarre things that happen. But I hope we have a little bit of a sense of the psychological conditions that help to explain how it is that most Americans at the time would go along with this policy, and that the Supreme Court itself, 6-3, would say that this policy made sense in the context of war, even though with President Reagan we look back now and see that the policy was a mistake. Just one last thing I want to do before wrapping up this discussion is reflect on this idea of hysteria, anti-Japanese hysteria. And in my own research, I have found a little bit of a counter-argument to that. Not to dismiss and not to question the idea that there was significant anti-Japanese feeling in the West. I think that that's obvious that there was, and we've seen articles which help to explain or describe some of the ideas that people had. But in my research, I came across this family called the Mikamis, and I first was drawn to the case of Mary Makami, and Mary's on the right there. This is Mary later in life, and there she is with her sister Flora and her parents. When I first saw a photograph of Mary in the public library, in a school book in the public library in Anchorage, Alaska, I think I saw a photo of her as a third grader. Given everything that I knew about sort of the situation of Japanese living in the American West in the early 20th century, I have a distinct memory of my heart going out to her and feeling sorry for this little girl of Japanese descent. She had moved with her parents to the United States from Japan when she was very young. And my heart sort of going out to her and feeling sorry for her and thinking that she must have had a really tough time. But as time went on, I discovered that this wasn't the case. I kept seeing Mary's name in different documents. She's the essay winner, and here she is. It says here, among the subjects treated in entertaining as well as informative fashion are the scholastic standing of students. Mary Makami heading the list, and there she is in the middle. Her sister Alice, also a quite accomplished student, and her sister Flora, and then they had a brother named Harry as well. And we'll just go through these photos. And what I found was that the Makami children, and I'm thinking especially of Alice and Mary, they seem to get along just fine. Here's a photo of Mary in the bottom left there as an honor student, and there she is at the head of the table. There's a wonderful photo of Mary in the middle, Alice on the left, with friends in Fairbanks, Alaska. Mary, after finishing school at the university there at Fairbanks, goes off on an anthropological study, and we see her there with these guys. I think most remarkably, one of the most remarkable things is this photo, which appears in the yearbook, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, which I think at the time went by a different name. The photo was taken in February 1942, in other words, not long at all after Pearl Harbor. And here is Flora at a dance, getting along just fine. One of the real surprises of this is that I did some research and learned that Mary's sister had married a man named Snodgrass, and so Alice now is Alice Snodgrass and lived in a certain town. And so I called a number and got on the phone Alice's son. And I said, I'd love to, come by and talk to you about your mom, assuming that she had, that she wasn't alive any longer because she would have been in her 90s at that time. But he said, why don't you come over here and talk to my mom yourself? And so on 2 occasions, I was able to go and talk with Alice. And the question I remember the most is I said, Alice, even on December 8th, 1941, did you not feel that folks looked at you different because, you're of Japanese heritage? And Alice said, if they did, I wasn't aware of it. I didn't notice any change. Now we go back to this photo here, and we again see kind of the weirdness of this. Flora was married to a Canadian, when the Second World War began for the United States, and she was not interned. She was married to a Canadian of European descent. Mary was living in the East Coast. And I think one of the arguments against the idea that the internment of Japanese was a purely racial thing is that not all Japanese in the United States were interned. This was a policy directed at Japanese living in the West. Mary was living in the East. She was in New Jersey. Her brother Harry was also in the East, and he was not interned. So Mary was not interned. Harry was not interned. Flora, married to a Canadian of European descent, was not interned. Strangely, her parents, who are well beyond military age, they were in California at the time, and they were interned. So it's a complicated thing. I think in response to the one Supreme Court justice who construed the internment policy as, purely a racial thing, I think the argument against that is that, well, not all Japanese in the United States actually were interned. It was geographically confined to those Japanese living on the American West Coast. That doesn't make it any better of a policy, but it does complicate it a little bit. It does seem to suggest that those who said that this was a military necessity, that at least they thought that that was true. They didn't go on to say, that Japanese throughout the United States need to be interned. So that doesn't excuse the policy, but I think it does help us to see that, was there a racial component? Certainly, obviously there was a racial component. Was there also, in the minds of those who put this policy into effect, some what they perceived to be military necessity? That also seems to be the case. So we have a lot of complications, and this is what we face in history. Often for the sake of getting through stories, we have to generalize. But often what happens is when we get to the ground level, things get more complicated. I think that's the case here. In any event, for Flora, despite everything that happened, for Flora, her life continues, and here she is dancing, at the university in Fairbanks, just a couple months after Pearl Harbor. And here's Alice, who, when I had the incredible privilege of talking with her, told me that even the day after Pearl Harbor, she didn't have a feeling that her fellow Americans looked at her any differently. Now, at the same time, as we get close to wrapping this up, in Anchorage there was another Japanese family, the Khmer family. And as soon as Pearl Harbor happened, the Khmer family sat down and put out this message, published in the newspaper in Anchorage, reminding their neighbors that, yes, we are of Japanese heritage, but we are Americans first. And if the Khmers were certain that, no one would think differently of them because of Pearl Harbor, then it's unlikely they would have, printed a message like this. And so the fact that they did indicates that they weren't certain that their neighbors would not look at them differently. And so, you've got this on the one hand, the Khmers feel compelled to publish this article the day after Pearl Harbor. On the other hand, Alice, just 30 miles away from Anchorage, says that she didn't really feel anything different. So it's a complicated situation. And it's important to remember that here in the 1940s, we're talking about a pre-civil rights era, right? There are a lot of assumptions that we have post-civil rights era. A lot of assumptions we have in the early 21st century that simply did not exist in 1941, 1942. This is one of the challenges of history, remembering that what we know, a lot of that knowledge wasn't available to people at the time. And so we want to exercise a little grace. Nothing that we've said takes away from the recognition that we look back on the internment policy and say, yeah, that was a mistake. We wish that hadn't happened. We wish that chapter of American history had not been written. And so we agree with what President Reagan says. Yeah, we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was a mistake. I think everybody recognizes that. And we can say that it happened because of hysteria. We can say that it happened because of racial animosities. And you know, those words, those terms mean something, and they give us some information, but they don't give us a lot of information. We want to try to understand what happened. What were the ideas that people had in their heads? What were the assumptions that people had in their heads when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, and then later when this internment policy came down? Why did ordinary, decent people think at the time that that was a good idea? That's one of the challenges of history, and I hope that you know, as we review the things that we've seen in this video, I hope that we have maybe a little more understanding.